This president, I think, has exposed himself as a guy over and over and over again who has a deep-seated hatred for white people or the white culture.
Here you have a black president trying to destroy a white policeman. I think he's genuinely revved up about race. You know me. I think he is genuinely angry in his heart and has been his whole life.
I think he's a racial opportunist.
I had a dream. I had a dream that I was a slave building a sphinx in a desert that looked like Obama.
He has a problem. This guy is, I believe, a racist.
And after that, they're going to go after Oreos. Might have to put that off till Obama's out of office, but they'll eventually go after Oreos.
You know, the racial divide in this country didn't disappear when Barack Obama was elected president. And no reasonable person has expected it to. But it is somewhere between eyebrow-raising and breathtaking to have such blunt, unvarnished race baiting so forward in our national political discourse right now. And the type of race baiting to which we're being subjected is fairly specific and fairly consistent. The argument that the president hates white people, for example, which you just heard Glenn Beck make on Fox News, that it's he, the president, who is racist, that argument dovetails perfectly with the arguments made against Supreme Court nominee Judge Sonia Sotomayor in the far more genteel setting of the United States Senate.
Many of Judge Sotomayor's public statements suggest that she may indeed allow or even embrace decision-making based on her biases and prejudices.
A wise Latina.
Your wise Latina comment.
Already prejudiced against one of the parties.
Allow biases and personal preferences. She said that a wise, quote, a wise Latina would more often than not reach a better conclusion than a white male.
And that ethnicity and gender can and even should have an impact on a judge's decision-making.
The language of our Republican senators is less blatant than the language of professional conservative talkers. But the theme is the same. What we have here are ethnic minorities who can't be trusted to use their official power fairly because they're prejudiced against white people. You know, with or without outrageous cracks about the biracial president being an Oreo, as we just heard from Rush Limbaugh, the conservative movement and the Republican Party are positioning themselves the same here. They're positioning themselves as defenders of the interests of white America against the threat posed to white America by people like Obama and Sotomayor. Are white people in America enraged by having a black president? By the success of people like Obama and Sotomayor? Is there outrage that being white in America no longer guarantees you monopolistic access to the positions of greatest power in this country? There must be some, certainly, but whether or not this race-baiting political tactic succeeds in the 2000s depends on whether there's enough of that kind of tappable white outrage out there to compensate for how bad it makes these guys look to be seen spewing this kind of overt racial invective. Joining us now is Melissa Harris-Lacewell, Associate Professor of Politics and African American Studies at Princeton. Melissa, thanks very much for joining us tonight. Apparently your audio, I have been warned, is a little hoopty, so I hope you don't mind yelling about this topic.
I can certainly yell, although then I'll probably be called an angry black woman. And since I have a white mama, maybe an angry black Oreo, but I'll yell. It's fine.
Can we get wise in there somehow? Wise as an insult?
Wise, angry black Oreo. Okay, I can do that, yeah.
All right, well, let me ask you here what you think the strategy is behind so many figures on the right calling the president racist.
Well, so, you know, as a political scientist, you always want to start with the assumption that a political party, whatever choices it's making, are trying to seek office, right? So we've talked about this a couple of times, and I've tried to think about how this is somehow a strategy of the right or a strategy of an element of the GOP to somehow gain office either in the midterm elections or, you know, more long-term for the presidential race. But the other part I think that I have maybe not been thinking about as carefully is that when we think about the history of race in America, sometimes we have to put aside the notion of strategy and just embrace the reality that race in this country has often brought out irrational anger, fear, anxiety, emotionalism. So it is possible that this is not actually a GOP or a conservative strategy, but is instead really kind of an emotional tantrum on the part of some members of the conservative wing who really just are floundering as they look at a world that is changing so dramatically around questions of race.
I am with you to the I guess I could say I was with you on it being an irrational tantrum until I started to see the same very specific tactic used in very different venues about very different subjects. This idea of the person who is not white being the problem racist, being used against Sotomayor, being used in so much of the discourse about the Gates arrest, being used against the president now, inexplicably unrelated to any policy issue, but just as a free-floating critique of the president. And it does make me wonder about this as an overt political strategy. And if it is one, do you think it's right to sort of use a white outrage-o-meter to try to measure tappable white outrage to decide whether or not it's going to work as a strategy?
Well, you know, if we can remember that President Obama paused in the middle of the primary race to speak in Philadelphia about the question of race in America, and he set up sort of two possibilities: black anger, rooted in a history of African-American inequality, and white resentment, rooted in a sense of kind of a loss of racial privilege. Now, I think that in many ways it's a very accurate assessment of in sort of the ways that blacks and whites, not completely and not perfectly, but often perceive things quite differently. So I've spent the month in New Orleans, and Hurricane Katrina is a perfect example of this. Everybody in the country was mad, but African Americans saw the failures of the federal government around Katrina as a race issue. White Americans who were still angry about the failures of the government saw it primarily as a bureaucratic issue rather than a race issue. So here you had these two groups with very different perspectives. Now that made all the difference in being able to make policy. So I think that they're hoping that these differences in how blacks and whites often see the world can be a perfect kind of wedge to use on health care, to use on education, to use on a wide variety of issues that in fact really, I mean, if we don't fix health care, it is bad for all Americans. But if we can somehow kind of suggest that the president is just trying to do things that are good for black people and bad for white people, then it opens up that kind of possibility of anxiety, distrust, and different perceptions.
Melissa Harris-Lacewell, Associate Professor of Politics and African American Studies at Princeton University. I think that's tremendous insight. That sort of insight is the whole reason that I sought you out in the first place and have had you back on this show so many times. It's really invaluable. Thanks, Melissa.
I love being here.
No, thanks very much.